Hey guys, I'm recording this on March 28th, 2025, and I almost feel like renaming Brass Check We Told You So. If you've been watching the podcast sphere recently, guess what name you've heard over and over again? A name that you never heard before until you heard it on Brass Check 6 months ago, and that would be more than 6 months ago, actually, and that would be James Jesus Angleton. Now that some more of the largely bogus JFK files, and I'll explain that in a second, that came out recently, mention his name a lot, and suddenly all the podcast guys are experts on James Jesus Angleton, and when I call them bogus files, we put something up about this a while ago, but it bears repeating. If you have a case against somebody, you bring the case, right? You don't leak files to the public. You bring your evidence to a judge, and you get an arrest warrant, and you have the person arraigned, and you start the whole criminal justice process. You don't leak random files over a 60-year period. So clearly there's no intention to bring anybody to justice over the JFK or the RFK or the MLK or the Malcolm X assassinations. This is all just shadow play. It's a kabuki theater. It's a joke. And the joke's on us, unless we decide not to be fools. But in any event, they've decided to drip out the name, finally, at long last, James Jesus Angleton. Of course, if you're a Brass Check listener, you know all about James Jesus Angleton. So I'm going to do a little review on James Jesus Angleton because I've watched about 20 podcasts and I've discovered 20 brand new James Jesus Angleton experts who don't know what the freaking hell they're talking about. And they're leaving out all the important things. All right. So let's understand who James Jesus Angleton was. First of all, he was the director of counterintelligence for the CIA. All right. Counterintelligence is basically the spy versus spy department. They spy on the other spies, but part of their job is to make sure the other spies don't spy on us. And another part of their job is to make sure that operations that are covert are designed correctly and remain covert, not just for a week or a month or a year, but for all time. That's kind of an important job. And so the most important thing to know, and not one of these podcasters, and I'm talking about the big ones with the multi-million dollar, budgets and the viewers and not one of them has described this basic thing about what counterintelligence is. It's like, guys, come on. It ain't that hard, but I guess it's hard for them. So once you know that James Jesus Angleton was director of counterintelligence, all kinds of things should become obvious to you. And of course, they are to Brass Check viewers. What else? What else? So that's the first important thing that you need to know about James Jesus Angleton, right? When they just toss up, so many of them have said, "Oh yeah, he's a CIA agent." He's not a CIA agent. Do you know what an agent means versus an officer? And he's not even an officer. I mean, he was a CIA god. Okay, it's certainly not a CIA agent. I mean, this is just such. I mean, guys, I get frustrated. I get frustrated with the idiocy of the podcasters. So you now know what counterintelligence is. If you're a Brass Check viewer, you've known this for a long time, but this is for new people. If you don't know what counterintelligence is, you can't understand the significance of somebody being director of counterintelligence. The next important thing to know about James Jesus Angleton, which none of the podcasters have talked about, zero, is that he was director of counterintelligence for over 20 years. Over 5 different CIA directors' reigns. I mean, this is like J. Edgar Hoover territory. This is Anthony Fauci territory. And by the way, this is a guy that never had to go through a congressional hearing. Like Fauci, like Hoover, he had the job for life, and you couldn't question him. Okay, so head of counterintelligence, we know what counterintelligence is, and now we're looking at the fact that this guy from the 50s to the 70s was head of counterintelligence, unquestioned, unreported, unpaid attention to. In fact, his official biography is called The Ghost. And it's interesting, the guy that wrote his official biography has been on a lot of podcasts. And either he's deliberately leaving out some of these facts when he's on the podcast, or they're asking him to leave them out, or he's being edited. I don't know. But I'm kind of shocked that a guy that knows so much about Angleton tells so little in these extended podcasts he's been on. So we now know he was head of counterintelligence. We know what counterintelligence is. We know he's been doing it. He was doing it for 20 years, and until he screwed up, because he became nuts. He was a really just off the handle, off the hook alcoholic, and he just had to go. But if he hadn't been, he might, and still alive, he still might be director of counterintelligence, and no one would be paying any attention to him. So those are the big things that you need to know about James Jesus Angleton. There's been a cover-up of these assassinations, correct? Whose job is it to cover up covert CIA activity? That would be the director of counterintelligence. That would be James Jesus Angleton. So that means at a minimum, he was the quarterback for the cover-up. Now, when bad things happen and somebody's given the job of the cover-up, don't you think maybe he was possibly involved in the operation himself? Now, remember, the operation had to be covert itself, right? It had to be designed to be impenetrable and covert. Who does that kind of design? Who does that kind of advisory within the CIA? Well, that would be the counterintelligence division, and the head of it, again, James Jesus Angleton. But let's look at some elements of his background that, again, watch a million podcasts, guys. You'll hear it now. Everybody knows who James. I mean, everybody's spouting the name, right? But nobody will tell you these basic things. So let's talk about some of the basic things. He grew up in fascist Italy. His father was head of National Cash Register in Italy. They were part of the family that had, I think, owned a big part of National Cash Register. He came from a very rich family. And he grew up in fascist Italy, okay? Which meant, I mean, if you were head of, cash registers don't seem like a big deal, but in the teens, 20s, and 30s, that was high tech. That was as high tech as we got, right? So if you were the head of National Cash Register, because every cash was kept in a drawer before that, right? The idea of a machine with little buttons and you could see the amount and the drawer would come out and you'd have a tab. I mean, that was high tech. So if you were head of National Cash Register, you were a big banana. Is that even a term? Top banana in the business world. So his father happened to be in Italy running National Cash Register for Italy. Italy was fascist. So that meant his dad was entertaining lots of fascists, because believe me, you were not a communist or a Republican or a Democrat in Italy during those years. You were a fascist. So he was imbued with the fascist attitude. Then he went to one of these prep schools, and he went to Yale, then he went into the OSS, and he ended up in Italy. And one of his jobs was to deal with fascists and Nazis, because apparently our government loves fascists and Nazis and couldn't get enough of them. And so he was part of the rat line. He was part of the guy laundering the reputations of mass murderers and war criminals and fascist Nazi sympathizers, and helping them find a new life in America or wherever else. This is what he was doing in his 20s, right? So he's raised by a fascist-friendly father, went to a fascist-friendly university, Yale, worked for the OSS, and was part of the rat line helping fascists find their way to a better world, right? So this is where the guy's got his start, okay? You ever heard, guys, watch every darn podcast where James Jesus Angleton's name is mentioned. You won't hear this mentioned even once, right? What else do we know about him? He was the guy that did the deal that connected organized crime to the CIA, or initially the OSS and then the CIA. He was the liaison. Right? Kind of important. Now, if we think of the Kennedy assassination, we're always being told the CIA worked with the Cubans, worked with the organized crime. Well, that's a little too vague to be useful. How about we have the name of the guy that handled the liaison work? He was also involved in Cuba. He was involved in the failed Bay of Pigs operation. What was his job? Well, he was director of counterintelligence, so his job was to keep the operation. When you're going to invade a country, you got a lot of stuff to hide, right? So he was part of the design of keeping the preparations secret, right? Um, and then he was part of the design of confusing the matter after it was over, right? So very involved in Cuba. Knew Cuban people, obviously knew the Cubans that were going to go in and try to take the country over. In this, he shared a connection with the organized crime guys because Cuba was their dreamland, right? Uh, pre Las Vegas. What could be better if you're a mobster and you want to run casinos than to rule the country? And basically, Batista, who ran Cuba, said, "Okay, you guys run the casinos. Give me my cut," and just turned the whole business over to the mob. And then the mob also shared, hitmen and enforcers with the Batista regime. Um, because you had to have security at the casinos and at the nightclubs, right? And then those guys would double as hoodlums for Batista. Really sweet operation. By the way, when Cuba fell to the communists, who was on the boats? Well, those that didn't get taken to the sports arena and shot were Batista agents. These were guys that went out and murdered students, murdered political activists, murdered members of the community, and Cuba's hardball, man. They would just shoot people and leave their dead bodies in the street. You never hear about that, right? You just hear about the palm trees and the cigars, right? No, they played hardball in Cuba, and uh, anyway, that's another milieu that Mr. Angleton hung out in because, again, if you're going to do an invasion, you got to deal with thugs, right? If the CIA is going to coordinate an invasion, you got to find the motivated thugs to go and do it, right? So this is another place. Now, so you won't hear this in the podcast universe. Here's another thing that you won't hear about, okay? Uh, Angleton ran a false defector program. What's a false defector program? You take strapping young American soldiers and you train them. You find the right ones, first of all, and then you train them, and then you have them pretend to be defectors and send them to the Soviet Union. Sound like Lee Harvey Oswald? Oh, yes, indeed. He wasn't the only one. There were other Marines that were trained. There was a training base for that in North Carolina. Okay, and Oswald just happened to be one of them. Who ran that program? You won't hear this on any of the podcasts. All the new experts on James Jesus Angleton, they'll say, well, he was tracking Oswald. Yeah, because Oswald was part of his false defector program. Of course he was tracking him. He had an investment in the guy. So you won't hear that from the podcast universe. You'll just hear there was a guy named James Jesus Angleton. Now here's the big one, and this one the podcasters do not want to touch. And maybe there are some that are talking about it. I haven't found one yet, unless I've been on it. James Jesus Angleton was a Zionist. Okay, now he was I was going to say he was an unusual Zionist, but he's not. He was one of the many atheist Zionists. He didn't have a religious bone in his body. He certainly wasn't Jewish. He was a WASP. He was anti-Semitic, I'm sure, if he went to Yale, in that era. But he was a Zionist. What does that mean? Zionism means you want some European thinking thugs to be in the Middle East, banging heads, bashing heads on behalf of us. That's what Zionism is. It has nothing to do with Judaism. In fact, talk to a real rabbi, not a corrupted one, but a real rabbi. Read the books. Judaism, let's see, 3,000 plus years old. Zionism, 120 plus years old. Judaism is a pacific religion. They're pacifists. Judaism is very clear. You cannot have a kingdom on earth until the Messiah comes back. They're waiting for the Messiah still, okay? And in their view, you are forbidden from having a kingdom until the Messiah comes back. You are forbidden from entering the Temple Mount. That's why they're praying outside the walls. That is by religious dictate. Okay, now you have the Zionist lunatics that are going in and desecrating mosques and marching around, but they're not, I don't know what they are, man. Well, they're Zionists. We know what they are. But anyway, James Jesus Angleton was a Zionist. Who said? The Israeli government. They said he was the most important Zionist in America. Why aren't you hearing this on the podcasts? I don't know. I don't know. We have a book. You know all about the book. Maybe we'll put it up in the corner or this corner or one corner. It's all in the book. A few of the podcasters have been intelligent enough to have me on, but most of them just have random people on talking randomly with everything I've talked to you about in this podcast. You will not hear on any of the podcasts from Rogan on down. What are they doing? It's a mystery to me. It's a mystery to me. So he was a Zionist, and a popular one in Israel. There are not one, but two memorials to James Jesus Angleton in Israel. Okay? What else? In addition, check this out. And again, try to find it on a podcast. I haven't been able to find. One guy mentioned this fact of history. In addition to being director of counterintelligence, he was also the CIA's liaison to Israel. He had two jobs. There ain't no one in the CIA today that has two jobs like that. But for some reason, James Jesus Angleton was director of counterintelligence and the CIA's liaison to the state of Israel. Now, a couple of overnight experts on James Jesus Angleton have disclosed that he was also the liaison to the Warren Commission. He was the CIA's liaison to the Warren Commission, but I think maybe 1 out of 20 have mentioned that. But the more important thing is he was the liaison to the CIA's. He ran the Israel desk. So what's the Israel desk? Think about this. There's a desk. I mean, actually, it's a lot of people, and central intelligence. That's what they're supposed to be. All the reports on Israel come to where? Come to the Israel desk. Who's running the Israel desk? James Jesus Angleton. That's all that information is collated and gathered, and then it's disseminated to the rest of the agency. It's disseminated up to the director. It ends up going to the president, some of it, right? So if you're head of a desk for a country, you basically control all the information coming to our country about that country. So James Jesus Angleton was head of the Israel desk, in addition to being director of counterintelligence. Okay. What else do we need to know? You've heard of this thing called the Mossad, right? Well, you can't just create like a world, and they're pretty world class. I'll give them that. They're capable, they're competent, right? You can't just create an intelligence agency out of thin air. You need training. The OSS needed training from the boys in the UK because they've been doing it for hundreds of years, right? So they trained us. Who trained the Mossad? Well, that would be James Jesus Angleton and the CIA. The Mossad is a CIA creation, and so they work very closely together. You won't hear this on any of the podcasts, but this is historical fact. None of this is speculative. None of this is conspiracy theory. Anybody that knows the history of intelligence knows that the Mossad was created to a large extent with the help of the CIA. So again, you won't hear this on any podcast. Don't you think that some of these things are important? Now, here's the last piece, and this even appears in the book, The Ghost, but good luck finding the author of The Ghost on a podcast. He's on podcasts, but I haven't heard him mention this little fact. One of the many things that James Jesus Angleton did during his spotted career was he helped steal a nuclear material from the United States to send to Israel so they could develop their nuclear weapons program. Okay? This apparently is an accepted fact in history because it's in James Jesus Angleton's biography. This was being done in the 1950s and the 1960s, while at the same time, our president of our country, JFK, was fighting with the Israelis and saying, look, guys, if you're building an atomic bomb, you're in trouble. We're going to cut you off. We're not going to support that. In fact, we need to get into your labs. We need to see what you're doing. And so on the one hand, you have the elected president of the United States saying no nuclear bombs for Israel, and you have the director of counterintelligence and the head of the Israel desk helping the Israelis get nuclear material. Who do you think killed John F. Kennedy? Who do you think had the great? I mean, all kinds of people had motivation. Hoover had it. Johnson had it. Dulles had it. The gangsters had it. Well, James Jesus Angleton certainly had it, right? Because had he been caught doing what he did, and somehow he was good at keeping secrets. Had he been caught doing it, that's a hanging offense. I mean, that's treason of the highest order. So we always hear that the military-industrial complex was involved, and we hear that the CIA, too vague to be useful. That's like saying China did it or Africa did it. We need to know who at the CIA did it. So we know that the military-industrial complex did it. We know that the CIA did it. We know that the mob was involved. We know that the Cubans were involved. And they just happened to leave out the guy who was the connection between all those people. And that would be James Jesus Angleton, again, a Zionist, an atheist Zionist. They do exist. Look it up. I can't explain it to you in this particular podcast. He was beloved by the Israelis, 2 memorials, helped them get the bomb, grew up in a fascist household, was friendly to fascists and Nazis from the cradle practically. That was his really first serious job, was helping Nazis and fascists escape Europe. This was a bad guy. This was a guy that had the motive to kill Kennedy. He had the means like nobody else. And he had the opportunity to do it. So surely at this point we can say that when we're listing the likely conspirators in the Kennedy assassinations, plural, because that's John and Robert, we have to include, we don't have to do it tentatively, we can include James Jesus Angleton, and we've got to point out that James Jesus Angleton was way connected to Israel. Now, does that mean Israel killed Kennedy? No, but it means when you're showing the team, you have to include the Israelis. You have to include the Mossad. You have to include people at the highest level of the Israeli government who were involved, along with the mob, along with elements of the CIA. By the way, not rogue elements. I love how they're always talking about the rogue elements of the CIA. The director of counterintelligence is not a rogue element in the CIA. Okay? That's core CIA. So core CIA, top-level mobsters, Meyer Lansky for sure. And by the way, they always leave Meyer Lansky out. You always hear about Johnny Roselli, and you always hear about, Carlos Marcello, and, all those guys worked for Meyer Lansky. It's just kind of nuts, man. But Meyer Lansky, the guy that worked with James Jesus Angleton to connect the mob to the CIA. Yeah. He happened to be a Zionist himself. He was involved in running guns to Israel when it was illegal to run guns to Israel. It was once a time when it was illegal, and he was running them. He was probably involved in helping get that nuclear material to Israel. He had a big holding. He was the main mobster in Cuba. So when Cuba went down and he lost that, he was if you're looking for a disgruntled Cuban, he wasn't Cuban. He was a guy from Brooklyn, but there was no more disgruntled person on earth than Meyer Lansky when Cuba fell to the communists. And again, Lansky and Angleton were colleagues. All right. Everything I've talked about on this podcast, I invite you to watch 10,000 multi-million-dollar podcasts with them spouting off on James Jesus Angleton. You won't hear any of this stuff. I don't know why. I can't figure these people out. They've all received my material. I don't know whether they throw it in the junk, the garbage. I don't know. But they prefer to give you the useless, watered down version of who James Jesus Angleton was. And once America wakes up and realizes that it was the CIA, the mob, and the Israelis, let me say it again, and the Israelis that killed John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy, probably Martin Luther King, um, and almost certainly Malcolm X, um, maybe we'll have a change in this country, and we'll stop disgracing ourselves and impoverishing ourselves and destroying our reputation around the world on behalf of basically a criminal regime that's engaged in genocide. Um, I feel like we should cue the music to dream the impossible dream. But anyway, we keep plugging along. If you haven't gotten the book, get the book. If you're not talking the book up, talk the book up. If you know any of these idiot podcasters, ask them to get a clue. It's past time, guys. It's past time that you took this seriously. Anyway, this is Brass Check. Thanks for all your support. To everyone that supports us, you're the reason that occasionally I get on here and say these things when nobody else will. All right, take care. Bye-bye.